Right, religious persecution. We've got a very good panel here today. Can I just introduce everybody? Nate Phelps, we'll be hearing from Nate later. He's the Executive Director of the Centre for Inquiry in Calgary. He's on the Board of Directors for Recovering from Religion, and he's the son of Pastor Fred Phelps of the Westboro Baptist Church, a church that Nate left as soon as he was physically able. And I'm sure we'll hear a little more about that soon. Next to Nate, we have Iran Geoff, who is the past president of the Australian Skeptics, a member of the Skeptic Zone podcast. He's a regular contributor to the Skeptic magazine and a public speaker on matters relating to science, skepticism, and critical thinking. And he also grew up in Israel, so he will have, I hope, a unique perspective on this panel, particularly in relation to the concept of religious persecution. And at the end, we have Jonny Scaramanga. Jonny is a musician. You see, this is what happens when printers pack in and you have to rely on your own handwriting. Jonny is not a museum, he's a musician and an atheist. He was raised in a fundamentalist Christian household, and he was educated using the accelerated Christian education system. Since leaving the church, he has campaigned against creationism and fundamentalist thinking, and he is also now the proud owner of an Occam for the Best Event, or was it Best Blog? One of them.
If I were a museum.
Yeah. I'm Geoff Whelan. I'm the organiser for Greater Manchester Skeptics. I also write a legal column for the Skeptic magazine. I help run QED, and in my spare time, I practice as a criminal barrister. So, if we can move on to the question. Religious persecution. In this country, for example, we have vocal religious groups who've claimed that equality laws are infringing their right to practice their faith. Yet in other countries, the dominant religions are undoubtedly persecuting the minority. So the first question is this, religious persecution, is that something that the religious do, or is it something that they suffer? Nate?
Yes. Okay, so I'll speak from the perspective of having grown up and lived in North America for the past 55 years. I recently did a chapter for a new book on the evils that specific churches and pastors have committed on people in the past, and focused on the story of Gilbert Goth. I don't know how many are familiar with him. He was the first priest who was prosecuted for molesting young boys. And one of the things that came out of that study was the recognition that the way we tend to treat religion and the religious folks in our society, especially Christianity in America, is with kid gloves. There seems to be a sense of entitlement in how we respond to claims of wrongdoing. In fact, in the case of Gilbert Goth in 1972, he was approached by several parents whose children were his victims. At that point, he acknowledged having molested 3 of them, and their response, rather than to immediately turn him over to the local authorities, was to ask him if they could help him. And he asked if they could get him a psychiatrist. They did, and they paid for 6 months worth of sessions. And then years later, by some estimations, after he had molested an additional 95 to 100 more boys, they finally started the process of bringing civil charges against him, some of the parents. And once again, you saw this tendency towards coddling and protecting rather than treating them as the criminals that they were. So you will forgive me if I tend to treat that kind of claim today in America as a bit disingenuous.
Iran, can you give us perhaps an Israeli perspective?
Yeah, so I probably should start by giving a bit of a background into what the position is of religion in Israel, because it's what you see in the news is not necessarily the way things are. So, first of all, Israel is a largely secular country. About 30% say they're religious in the census, and an additional 20 to 25% confess to some kind of affinity to religion. There's terms in Hebrew for that, but basically they do not necessarily keep the kosher or the rule what they need to do around the Sabbath, not working on the Sabbath and all that, but they may go to synagogue from time to time. So it's largely a secular country. The laws are generally secular, but there are niches where religion really makes its way. For example, the marriages and divorces are governed by the religious system. And in Israel, if you cannot marry, there is no such thing as a civil union, which leads to some really interesting things. Like, for example, Jews have to marry through the rabbinical system, and Muslims have to marry through the Islamic system, and Christians through, they need a priest in their wedding. But what if you're a mixed couple of, coming from two different religions? There is no solution in Israel. And what if, like me, you just don't want a rabbi in your wedding, and you have to resort to all kinds of things like going to Cyprus, or in my case, I wasn't at my own wedding. I got married by proxy in Paraguay. And it's funny. You go to Wikipedia to look at marriage by proxy, and you find that there's very few countries that allow it. So Israel allows it. And the reason it's allowed is because there's no other solution for people. So now the reason that happens, even though the religious are actually a minority, is because of the political system in Israel that it's representative. It's not. Sorry? Proportional representation is the word I was looking for. Thank you. So the religious parties hold the balance of power and have done for the past 60 years. So they have a lot of clout, and they use that to advance their point of view. Other than marriages and divorces, there's really not a huge amount that they control, but they tend to use their position of power to get a lot of benefits for their own people, for their own congregations. So a lot of the kind of benefits that the religious see in Israel are to do with having a better position in society. For example, the ultra-Orthodox do not have to serve in the military, or didn't until very recently. And now that the laws have changed and they have to serve in the military, obviously they're not going down without a very, very big fight. But that was a privileged position they were in. And obviously I think that's something we see around the world. Mm-hmm. Religion, not just in Israel, but everywhere in the world, has been in a privileged position for centuries. And now that the world is becoming more and more secular, then obviously they don't want to give up that privileged position. I don't think there is a huge amount of persecution, religious persecution in Israel. So I don't think that by and large you see secular people being persecuted by religion, except for those things that I've mentioned. But and by the way, if you think, but the Jews persecute the Arabs or other way, there's a much more political persecution than religious persecution. And I think we have to leave religion to the side in that respect, of course, although of course it is related. But the persecution that the religious now feel is largely their old privileged position being taken away.
Good. Jonny?
Well, in the absence of having a religious representative on the panel, I feel it incumbent upon
We did try.
Yeah, I realise. To try and remember what it was like for me when I because I did have a perception that Christianity was a persecuted religion in this country, and I think there is this perception within Christianity from some sections of Christianity in the UK. So I recently wrote a blog post that was called 33 Jaw-Droppingly Stupid Multiple Choice Questions from Accelerated Christian Education. And a lot of evangelical Christians agree with me that this is an appalling form of education, but I can't get them to speak out about it. And so I emailed all my evangelical friends and said, why is this? Why won't you speak out against something which is happening that makes your religion look bad and which is something that you oppose? And it's a reply that I got from a friend of mine that I think is kind of instructive. And what he said is that I think what might be your biggest problem, which unfortunately has nothing to do with you, and so you can't do anything about it, is prejudice. And by that I mean Christians spend their entire lives being attacked from every corner of their life. Friends mocking them, colleagues guffawing at the fact you might actually believe something like that. The problem that's then created is that the minute a Christian sees an article to do with Christianity and they brave actually reading it, they tend to make a judgment fairly quickly. Is this another article mocking us, or is it something written from our point of view? I'll admit this is wrong, and it should be something more along the lines of, is this article a balanced discussion of something I'm concerned with? However, in my experience, articles like this are extremely rare, and as a result, you tend to just discount the opinion without thinking. So I guess what that long and rambling paragraph is trying to say is that Christians tend to feel victimized. So the minute they see an article which could potentially attack us, it's kind of assumed, unfairly though on the whole correctly, that it does just that, and so sharing it would be an odd thing to do. Even if you read it yourself and realise it's actually a well-written article, you might be worried that if you shared it, who knows what other Christians might think of you. Now, I remember thinking that Christianity was persecuted, and I remember thinking, you wouldn't say this about the Muslims. That was a real feeling that I had. And I think that perception, which does exist among some Christians in this country, it's not wholly based in fiction. I think that there is sometimes a reluctance from some sections of the media to attack Islam, but it's completely false to say that Islam gets an easy time of it. I mean, the tabloids, I think, demonise Muslims in this country a lot, and Christians don't see this, but I definitely had this perception that, like, it was okay to make jokes about Christians, but you wouldn't make those jokes about Muslims, because Muslims don't take any shit. Whereas Christians, these nice people, they don't. So that was how I used to see things.
Yeah. Well, we can come back to victimisation in a moment, but Aran, you touched upon the question of legislation and the effect that the religious, or the influence rather, that the religious have upon legislation because they hold the balance of power in Israel. Can you say a little bit more about that? So is it really... are they being persecuted, or are they in fact getting their way and having a privilege?
So I can speak about Australia in that respect as well, by the way. But definitely there are quite a few laws in Israel, and I'm sure that I actually know for a fact in the UK as well, definitely in the US, that are laws that are religion-based. I think gay rights is probably one area where it's plain for all to see. For example, in Australia, in all the surveys for the past 20 years or so show that consistently between 65 and 75% of the population support gay marriage or do not object to gay marriage. But still, we have an atheist. We had an atheist prime minister living with her, unmarried with her boyfriend, so just living her life without any religion, and openly atheist. Saying that she is still against gay marriage. And when you look at the arguments against gay marriage, they are so completely religious. There are no non-religious arguments against gay marriage. I'm sure Nate will have a few words to say about that. Yeah. So in Israel, there are quite a few laws that center around religion. For example, around what happens on the Saturday, on the Jewish Sabbath, about who's allowed to work. There are places, just some ridiculous things that I don't know how many of you know this, but Jews are in past centuries, to a certain degree today as well. Now technology helps a little bit, but sometimes you do need to switch on the light on the Sabbath. And that's a problem. You're not allowed to, according to Jewish law. So they would look for something called a Shabbos goy. It's a Gentiles that would help them. Somebody who was allowed to switch on the light. So they would go out in the street and find a Gentile and can you please switch on the light for me? So in Israel today, they probably don't do that. But what they do instead is that there are stores that want to open on the Saturday. Jews are not allowed to work on the Saturday. There are ways around it, but generally Jews are not allowed to work on the Saturday. So they employ Muslims or Druze or Christians. So there is still legislation that clearly makes that separation between what you're allowed and not allowed to do based on religion. It is not, I would not quite define it as persecution, but it is. But there are limitations based on religion, and obviously my opinion as a liberal is that you should not have laws based on religion. You should not. Your religion should not affect what rules apply to you.
If I can bring Nate in on that, I think we were having a chat yesterday. You've got some interesting state legislatures over in the States.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, they actually, my home state of Kansas, this was probably within 2 months, got it through the first house of legislation, the passage of a law that would basically decriminalize not providing services to people that you don't like. And thankfully, the second legislative house failed to pass the bill, so it never got to the governor for signing. Within 2 weeks of that, Arizona actually got it all the way through both houses, and it got to the governor's desk. And then something very interesting happened when people started looking at the pragmatic implications of that kind of legislation. They realized they had taken the wrong tact, and she ultimately vetoed the law. But it was my contention at that point that it would have probably been one of the best things that could have happened to the LGBT movement was to let something like that see the light of day, that kind of behavior. And it would have done as much good or perhaps more than my family's campaign did for the LGBT movement. In fact, though, there is still 32, I believe 32 states in the union there in America that make gay marriage illegal. We're slowly making headway on that issue, but that is clearly an example of where religion has privilege. California, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Proposition 8. In America, in some states, there is what's called a ballot initiative system where supposedly the average citizen can put something up on the ballot and people can vote on it and it can become law. Oftentimes they're challenged in court for the legal veracity of the language of the law, that type of thing. So Proposition 8 was put forth, was funded largely by the Mormon Church in neighboring Utah. And Proposition 8 was basically going to change the state constitution to make it marriage defined as between a man and a woman. And it passed narrowly. It was, I believe, the third such ballot initiative that had been presented in the previous 10 or 15 years. And each year you saw the gap closing, but it still failed in Proposition 8. It ended up before the court, and that's where Ron was talking earlier about the justifications, and the decision by that trial court judge is good reading if you have an opportunity to look it up, because they basically took every one of those ideas from a child will turn gay if they're with gay parents to a child will have a less appropriate upbringing, which I always kind of thought was humorous, because it's basically saying if you let them marry and have kids, then we're going to bully them, so don't let them marry and have kids, is the essence of that argument. So all of these quote-unquote legitimate non-religious ideas were presented in that trial, and the judge looked at every one of them, examined them, and destroyed them in his decision, and then concluded that really the only thing left was this idea of religious privilege, and that alone should stand for not letting gay people get married. And so he overturned the decision of the voters, and it has stood up so far in court. So now they have gay marriage in California. So that's
well,
it for legislation.
the courts in this country have an admirable track record, in my view, of dealing with these kinds of religious cases. I've been discriminated against because I run a Christian bed and breakfast and I don't want gay people to come and stay at my bed and breakfast. The court says, sorry, you can have whatever view you like as far as your religion is concerned, but if you are providing goods and services to somebody else, then you abide by the law of this country, and you cannot trump it by saying that we are infringing your freedom to practice your particular brand of bigotry. In fairness, I don't think the court would say it's a particular brand of bigotry, but it is, plain and simple. I did download from the Christian Institute their pamphlet. I say it's a pamphlet, it's about 70-odd pages, marginalising Christians, and they've gone through a whole list of areas that they think that Christians have been marginalised in public life in this country. It's a long list, and almost all of it is without substance. For example, when they talk about Christians being marginalised in the media, one of the examples they give is that Jeremy Vine feels that he can't really talk about his faith live on TV. Well, Jeremy Vine presents a news programme. He's supposed to deal with the news, not talk about his personal faith. They've got all the bed and breakfast stories in there saying that, well, if you want to open your doors and you're a Christian, why can't you open your doors in a Christian way and turn away the gay people? All sorts of other cases where there has been alleged discrimination. One case, a 5-year-old girl at church was pulled up, I think rightly, by the head teacher, pulled up in a nice way, because she told another young girl in that school that if she didn't believe in Jesus, she was going to go to hell. It turned out that the mother of that girl worked at the school as well, and she started an email petition amongst her evangelical friends, getting them all to pray and basically getting a bit of pressure on this school. And the school took action for gross misconduct. And I think when you do try and do something like that on the sidelines against a school that you're actually working for, that the school's within their rights to pull you up and have disciplinary procedures. So this long pamphlet, it's worth a read. It won't take you very long. It's available on the Christian Institute website. It's examples of them saying, look at us, we have been marginalised, we have been picked on. And they haven't really. It's almost as if, to go back to Jonny's point, it's victimisation, or rather victimhood, something that maybe they wear as, or would you think, Jonny, that they wear as a badge of pride?
Well, I don't know whether I think that I wore it as a badge of pride, but I did think that, like Jesus said, that you will be persecuted in my name. This is something that we should expect as Christians. And the whole narrative that I was raised with was, for Christians from the earliest time have been persecuted from the lions in the Roman arenas onwards. And the history course that I was taught at my Christian school was essentially the history of how good Protestant Christians have been persecuted by the bad people, but the Protestants have always won in the end, finishing with the crowning glory of the founding of America as a Protestant nation. And usually this persecution historically has come from Catholics, who were the evil, not proper Christians, and then later from the communists, who were general, ill-defined bogeymen. And what's interesting about this is that Candida Moss is an academic who has put together a persuasive thesis that, in fact, much of what is believed about the early persecution of Christians by Christians is either an exaggeration or an outright fabrication. And this narrative of Christian persecution doesn't have a historical basis in fact, but it is part of... I think that Christianity is a religion with a persecution complex, unlike any other, because although you might argue that Judaism has a persecution complex too, it at least has some basis in recent history.
So, where should the balance be? How do we decide that somebody's right should be perhaps curtailed? What should we take into account? Nate?
Well, I don't know. I would say that when you're talking about religion, when you look at the intent of the writers of the Constitution, while it's the whoop and cry right now in America is that America was a Christian nation. The founding fathers were all Christians, in spite of all of the evidence to the contrary. That what works best, and the intent of the writers was to make sure that no one religion was favored over another, that the government was not involved in that question, and that government in general should not include questions of religion in the decisions that they make for the society, that it should actually be a secular government separate from the churches, and religion would be practiced in the churches. That was the theory. I recall growing up there, the education that we got was that the Constitution was this once and for always document that declared the rights of the individual and the separation of church and state, and that in fact was how America was. And it wasn't until I grew older that I realized that while it is a profound document, that we have a long way to go to actually behave as though we believe that document, because there are still many places in America, first of all, the 32 states I mentioned earlier, that deliberately treat one group of people different from another in spite of the several locations in the Constitution that says all men are created equal and are entitled to equal treatment under the law. There are also still places in America where it is the law, in spite of the commandment in the Constitution that there will be no religious test for holders of public office. There are, in fact, laws that invoke a religious test by saying that atheists cannot hold office in that state or in that city or that community. So I think I've rambled on.
Is it still the case that atheists are always the bottom of the pile as far as trusted groups in America are concerned?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting dichotomy between the U.S. and Canada that I've observed, that in the U.S., if you don't discuss religion, if you don't make it known that you are a good, upstanding Christian, you're going to have a difficult time holding office. We saw in the last presidential election that in spite of our movement towards equality and justice, that Romney had a very difficult time because of his Mormonism, even though it's becoming more popular and more accepted. But absolutely, in the U.S., you have to hide your atheism, your non-belief, if you have any hope of winning public office there. Although a few have finally gotten in and are willing to admit it, that they are non-believers. So the tide is shifting ever so slowly in the direction of some more balance in that area.
Yeah. is secularism the only answer? Here's a quote from Christine Adone recently. I did try to get her for the panel, but sadly she declined. The faithful are a vulnerable group persecuted by right-on and politically correct fanatics who don't believe in free speech. Is that really true? All right.
I just want to refer, it's related, but the previous question you asked about when is it right for rights to be curtailed, and I think it's important to, when we talk about rights, not everything that you believe you should be able to do is a right. And I think rights should generally, things that can be termed as rights should not be curtailed. But there's the legal principle of that your right to wave your hands ends where my nose begins. So I think that with the thing about religious laws generally, I'm in favor of religious people of all faiths being able to exercise their religion freely. But their right to wave their religious hands ends where the noses of other people begin, and the right to discriminate against others and the right to prevent others from having their rights, that is what should not be allowed. So I'm against curtailing the rights of religious people, but the problem starts when some of these rights basically are the deprivation of other people's rights. And secularism is exactly about that. It's about not having religion decide for anybody in society what they should and should not do. So I think secularism should be the default position in a society that is anything but either 100% or close to 100% religious and of the same religion. I don't think there is another solution.
Jonny, do the Christians get it that, for example, saying, I don't want to entertain gay people in my bed and breakfast is in essence the same as saying no blacks, no Irish?
No, I don't think that they do. I didn't understand when people said that I was being bigoted. I didn't get it. I once got into a long and protracted fight with a Muslim boy at my school before I went to the crazy school when I was at a C of E primary. I ended up in a conversation at lunchtime with this Muslim boy, and I said to him that the Bible was the word of God, and he said no, God has produced 3 holy books, which are the Jewish Torah, is that the right term? And the Bible and the Quran, and I was like, no, you're very wrong about this. And it climaxed us with us telling each other that we were going to hell. And I thought no more of this until the next day when I was taken aside at lunch by the teachers and given a talking to. And I was like, what? But we both told each other that we were going to hell. How is this me? And then I realised, looking back on the story now, that actually he took a lot of provoking, whereas I was just straight in there with going to hell. But I was like, but what? But this is true. Yeah. Like I'm doing you a favour here because I'm giving you the opportunity to get saved. And similarly, when people used to say that I was a bigot for thinking that being gay was wrong, I was like, but it's wrong. Like, how is this bigotry? I didn't understand. One of the problems with privilege is that it is pretty much invisible to the people that have it. And this is why feminism has a hard time getting its arguments across, because understanding male privilege takes some doing, or understanding white privilege takes some doing. If you've just had this all your life, you're like, what, is this not the same for everybody? This is just how life is. And it was a real, I didn't get it. And there's a problem because if I'm talking here specifically about a certain type of literal Bible-believing absolutist who believe that they're certain that they know the absolute truth. And there's very little room for negotiation. If you think you know, that you have conclusive proof of something, then it's very difficult to talk to someone about that. But I think that there is the potential for dialogue to be better than it has been. Yeah. And I'm aware that I've been talking for quite a long time. If I can make one more point.
Please do.
Which is going to escape me the minute that I say that. No, talk about something else.
Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good time to start the Q&A, actually, and that'll give Jonny time to think about his point, and then he'll be able to bring it and shoehorn it into whatever question you come out with. Yeah.
I'm from Ireland, so we have a very particular, if you talk about the separation of church and state, they were in bed very early on and have never gotten out of that marital bed, as it were. But what was quite interesting that happened in Ireland over the last few years was the Blasphemy Laws. And that was framed, legislatively we had to do it because it was actually in the Constitution, so there had to be legislation for it. But the way that it was framed by people who perhaps didn't want to be seen as imposing Catholic Christianity on everybody was that it was framed as a way of protecting religious persecution. That by having barriers to being particularly offensive to certain religious groups, that was somehow protecting everybody. And I was just kind of curious as to how that was perceived maybe outside of Ireland, because it was kind of very quietly shunned away once Pakistan thought that we had a really good way of dealing with blasphemy. Everybody got very quiet when they were looking at us as a glowing beacon. I was just wondering what that kind of I suppose cognitive dissonance and flip-flopping, where you're trying to do both at the same time. How is that perceived?
Anyone want to feel that first?
No.
No?
No, I think it's a tough one. Personally, I do not believe that anybody has a right to not to be offended. So, so if you're curtailing my ability to say things because it offends you, then we have a problem. The laws should not be doing that. I think sometimes you look at the US, which has the most liberal freedom of speech laws in the world, I believe, and you see some of the stuff that happens in the name of, because of free speech there, and you say, it's taken to. You think it's taken to extremes, and then when
I think Nate might be able to say something about that.
But when you look at the alternative, when you start thinking about it, and say, okay, what is the alternative? What if we remove the right for hate speech? That there is no clear line between what should be allowed and should not be allowed, and therefore, generally, I think speech should be allowed. I think that obviously in the US as well, it probably should be noted, not everything is allowed, because the things that have practical implications and those immediate practical implications make the speech not allowed. But other than that, just offense is not something that should be a criterion.
I think that sometimes I used to believe, and I think I still do believe this, that it's possible for someone to have a religious objection to homosexuality but not be a bigot. But I think that in practice the two are almost always conflated. But I think that in theory it's possible to believe that something is morally wrong without being nasty or discriminatory towards people that do those things. And I used to believe that I was in that camp, and now I look at myself and I realise I wasn't at all. I was a bigot. So whether it's in practice ever possible, or whether it's just something that's theoretically possible, I'm not sure. But I do think that sometimes, if there's anything in that Christian Institute rant that has a glimmer of truth in it, it's that I think sometimes Christians that are preaching that being gay is wrong are immediately told that what they're practicing is hate speech when it isn't necessarily, which is not to defend what they're saying at all. But I don't know that it quite goes so far as to qualify as hate speech.
So you're saying just wrong?
Yeah, I'm saying I think that there may be times when they're accused of hate speech when actually it's a legitimate exercise of freedom of speech, however repugnant I find what they're saying. And I'm aware that there's the difficulty of the fact that it can legitimise bigotry, which can then lead to violence, and that's the argument for hate speech laws. But perhaps, if we're going to say no one has the right not to be offended, then if that's going to be applied even-handedly, then you have to say that that's going to go for gay people as well as for religious people.
Well,
can I just comment?
Oh, very quickly, go on.
I don't think I would not want to prevent Christians or anybody from saying that they object to gay marriage or anything for that matter. I would want to prevent them from preventing gay marriage.
Right.
So saying that they object to it, fine, go ahead, explain, tell your reasons.
Well, if you're against gay marriage, don't marry a gay person. I think that's... Nate, I think you have an interesting perspective on this.
Well, first of all, to kind of continue Iran's thought about no one has the right not to be offended, I also think that it says more about the person who's offended than it does about the person who offended. It is a way to say I'm incapable of managing my emotions beyond a certain point, so I now put the responsibility on you to prevent me from having to manage my feelings. As to what Jonny was saying, it's an interesting component of the whole dynamic in society when we're discussing an issue. Certain issues come to the fore. We're more sensitive about certain issues at times. I personally agree with Jonny that we can hold ideas, we can disagree with certain behaviors, and not be bigoted about it. And I think a perfect example of that is that one of the primary rules of Christianity is that you don't get divorced and you don't commit adultery or fornication. We can say, or a Christian can say, I disagree with divorce. And it would not be perceived, especially at this place and time, as being bigoted, because this issue is settled. It's not an emotional point that we're still contending with. So I think that's one of the things we have to take into consideration.
Right, that's a point that I should have made clearer, so thank you for making that.
Yeah.
Well, getting back to the blasphemy point, the UK lost the blasphemy laws a few years ago, although they do try and sneak them in by the back door with general public order offences all the time. And it's almost as if the tide has turned. I don't know if anybody was on the panel last year, the legal panel, and we had Ian Rushton from the Crown Prosecution Service. And I asked him about if somebody uploaded a video of their YouTube exploits, burning a Bible, would he prosecute under the public order offences? And he said, no. All right, if it was a Quran, would you? He says, yes. So, you know, the blasphemy law has gone, but it's still there in another guise. So we can all have a good laugh at Ireland adopting the blasphemy law, but we're no better in reality. So we've not got a lot of time, so do we have more questions? Oh.
I think it's easy for both sides on this argument, the secular side and the religious side, to get very entrenched in their views. But my question to the panel is whether they think that religious groups can both be the oppressed and the oppressors simultaneously.
Do we have
Who wants to go first there?
I think Nate covered it when he said yes at the very first question.
Yeah, no,
I think it's absolutely true.
So I think that's true of every group in society, is that we can find ourselves somewhere on a continuum where some of us, some people or some ideas are going to be quote unquote persecuted, and some are going to be accepted. We all have some form of privilege, unless we're gay. Well, actually, didn't they just pass that here in England?
Gay marriage, yeah? Got it?
Yeah, good on you. Congratulations. So, I tend to view most things in life as being on a continuum. So, certainly you can find yourself in both positions at once.
I think that something that secularism as a movement could do in this country is to make it clearer that its goal is to protect the rights of everyone to have their beliefs, and that there is a perception that secularism is an oppressive force, and that one way to combat that is to do more to say this is in the interests of religious groups in the long term, to make sure that everyone's rights are protected, and that would help, I think, to reduce any possibility of secularism being an oppressor, if it ever is.
Well, Eric Pickles recently voiced his views on this. He said, "We are a Christian nation. We have an established church. Get over it. And don't impose your politically correct intolerance on others." So he doesn't think we're a secular society. So he thinks, although we're clearly, in his view, a Christian nation, that we're imposing our views on him, the majority, the person in government who's actually making the laws, who seems to think he's made a law that allows councils to say prayers before meetings. Incidentally, the National Secular Society says that although that's what he thinks the law says, it may not actually do so, and it's not actually been challenged in court yet, and the National Secular Society are pretty certain that they've got some good arguments that Eric Pickles is wrong, which is good news. So, another question. I'm not picking the questions, Sue is. So. Yeah, you are.
Do you think the fact that the Church of Scientology can now carry out weddings will further the secular cause and actually hold up the other religions as being the ridiculous things that they are in the general public's view, who've never really considered these things?
Did everybody get that?
I didn't.
No, can you say again?
With the fact that the Church of Scientology can now carry out weddings, will that hold up the other religions to public ridicule that the general public have never really thought about before? Because the position of Scientology and how daft the public think it is, they will now start looking at the other religions and go, hold on, what's going on here?
So in other words, Scientology is really daft and they've got some legitimacy. Can we look at all the others because they're just as daft, really? Is that paraphrasing it? Yep.
I certainly think from the point of view of religious people, I don't think it's likely to. I know that I never had any difficulty in believing that all religions in the world were utterly stupid, apart from the one that I believed that was perfectly credible. And I don't imagine that will change now that Scientology is also in the club.
Yeah.
Yeah. Conceivably. Don't know if I have words there.
In the name of Zeno.
That's almost as good as Nate's yes earlier. Do you want to come in on that, Nate, or not?
No.
No.
I think it's interesting to note that Scientology is a much more of a hot button issue here in the United Kingdom than it is in America. Scientology is just another one in the morass of crazy in America. It doesn't have special privilege.
Okay, next question.
Thanks. I wanted to pick up on the idea of nobody has the right not to be offended. I kind of agree in principle, but then I'm deeply offended or actually really outraged by racism and by people making bigoted statements. So it doesn't quite work, does it, this idea that nobody has the right to not be offended? Because there are certain things where you think, well, no, that is beyond the pale.
I don't know. I think I have. Well, there is in this country, of course, hate speech laws for certain racist comments, but I would defend the right of people to. I would defend the right of people to hold racist views and to say racist things to quite some extent. I wouldn't. You're raising your eyebrows at me. I think that is. I think that's. If you're going to consistently apply a freedom of speech law, then it has to be. Has to include the views of the people that we find repugnant. I mean, there's no point in having a freedom of speech law if it's going to be for the people you agree with.
I think there's a big difference. There's a big difference between castigating or socially shunning people with racist views and sending them to jail.
Yeah, that's the distinction I would find too. Certainly, outrage is an important tool for humans to cause change. But like Jonny said, and this is the principle that allows my family to do what they do, it's important for us to not only allow, but to protect the ideas that we abhor, having public voice because tomorrow it may be your ideas that people want to tamp down. So be outraged, do something about it, but don't turn to the law, and don't use the government as a way to promote your ideas or prevent the ideas that you dislike from being expressed.
Well, we do have racially aggravated offences in this country, but they generally get tacked on to other offences.
Right.
So if you assault somebody and it's racially aggravated, then you get a heavier sentence at the end of the day. Or if you commit criminal damage and it's criminal damage of a racist nature, then again the penalty is heavier. But there are some straight offences where, you know, you just go up to somebody and you say something blatantly racist to them and offensive, and you will be prosecuted for a racially aggravated offence of threatening or abusive behaviour, likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress. So we don't have the same freedom of speech laws that America has, but perhaps it's about setting right a long wrong, in effect, because racism has been a real problem in this country. Maybe legislation has taken a step in changing people's perceptions. Maybe it goes too far, and I certainly am a free speech advocate, and it should be looked at to see whether there can be amendments. I think we have got rid of, as of February this year, an offence, I think, under Section 5 of the Public Order Act, which is an offence of insulting people. And that was, oddly enough, a campaign that was supported by both the National Secular Society and people like the Christian Institute, because they want to go round street preaching, saying that homosexuality is wrong, and the National Secular Society believe in free speech and don't believe that we should be prosecuted for telling the street preachers that they're wrong. So I think Section 5 has gone now, which is a good thing, so that's progress. But on that point, I think we're going a little over time. So can I just thank the panel, Nate, Iran and Jonny.